January 14, 1941. Broadcasting House, London. Victor de Laveleye sat in a cramped BBC studio, hands gripping a script that contained just one letter that would unite 50 million people across occupied Europe. One letter that Joseph Goebbels would spend the next 4 years trying to destroy. The Belgian exile's voice carried across the English Channel into the darkness of Nazi-occupied territory. He spoke for exactly 4 minutes. When he finished, he had no idea he'd just launched the most viral propaganda campaign in human history. Within 72 hours, the letter V appeared on walls in Brussels, Paris, Amsterdam, and Oslo. Within 2 weeks, German soldiers were forbidden from photographing any wall that displayed it. Within 6 months, Winston Churchill himself had adopted the gesture, transforming a simple hand motion into the defining symbol of Allied resistance. But 700 miles to the east, in Berlin, Joseph Goebbels watched these developments with cold calculation. He understood something the Allies were only beginning to grasp. Modern warfare wasn't won by bullets alone. It was won by the symbols that made men willing to die, or kill, for an idea they'd never questioned. This is the story of how both sides in World War II weaponized imagery to control the hearts and minds of Europe. It's the story of how a Belgian tennis player, a Nazi propaganda minister, and a British Prime Minister turned shapes, colors, and gestures into instruments more powerful than tanks. And it's the story of how 400 million Europeans found themselves caught in a psychological war where every poster, every flag, every symbol became a battlefield for their souls. In January 1933, Germany had just emerged from a decade of humiliation. The Treaty of Versailles had stripped the nation of territory, imposed crushing reparations, and left 6 million Germans unemployed. The Weimar Republic's democratic government had failed to restore national pride or economic stability. Into this vacuum stepped the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis, led by a failed artist named Adolf Hitler. On January 30, 1933, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Within months, he appointed Joseph Goebbels as Reich Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. Goebbels understood a fundamental truth that would define the next 12 years. Totalitarian control required more than force. It required making people believe they wanted what the state demanded. It required symbols that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to tribal instincts. The swastika, the hooked cross that would become the most notorious symbol of the 20th century, had existed for 5,000 years before Hitler touched it. Ancient Indian cultures used it to represent good fortune and prosperity. European archaeologists in the 1800s discovered it on artifacts from Troy and linked it to a mythical Aryan race. By the early 1900s, the swastika appeared on Finnish military aircraft, Latvian folk art, and even American Coca-Cola merchandise. It was a symbol of fertility, the sun, and cyclical rebirth. Hitler deliberately chose it in 1920 for precisely these ancient connotations. In Mein Kampf, he wrote that he spent countless attempts designing the perfect party symbol. He settled on a red background representing socialism, a white circle representing nationalism, and a black swastika representing the Aryan struggle. The color scheme intentionally mimicked Imperial Germany's black-white-red flag, visual nostalgia for past glory. The tilted dynamic swastika suggested movement, energy, inevitable forward momentum. It was the opposite of the static, vertical Christian cross. It suggested not sacrifice and redemption, but power and domination. When Goebbels took control of German propaganda in March 1933, the swastika was already the party's primary symbol. His genius lay in making it inescapable. Within 6 months, every German government building flew the swastika flag. Every Nazi party member wore a swastika armband. Every piece of official correspondence bore the swastika seal. Children drew swastikas in school. Factories stamped swastikas on products. Highways displayed swastika road signs every few kilometers. The Nazi eagle clutched the swastika in its talons on coins, stamps, and military insignia. By 1935, the swastika flag became Germany's sole national flag, replacing the Weimar Republic's black, red, gold banner. Goebbels had achieved what psychologists would later call symbolic saturation. The swastika appeared so frequently that Germans couldn't form a thought about their nation without the symbol intruding. But Goebbels understood that symbols needed emotional scaffolding. The swastika alone was just a shape. It became powerful when attached to carefully constructed myths. Nazi propaganda films showed the swastika rising over cheering crowds, positioned to catch sunlight, appearing to glow with divine radiance. Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will featured 10-minute sequences of nothing but swastika banners rippling in wind, shot from angles that made them appear to stretch to infinity. The visual message was clear. The swastika represented inevitability. It represented a force of nature that couldn't be stopped, only joined. Rally attendees received small swastika flags, hundreds of thousands of them, creating the visual impression that every German supported the movement. Hitler's speeches were timed to end precisely at sunset, allowing swastika banners to be illuminated by spotlights against darkening skies. Albert Speer designed cathedrals of light for Nuremberg rallies, 150 anti-aircraft searchlights aimed vertically, creating pillars of light between which swastika flags appeared to float in the heavens. The swastika wasn't presented as a political logo, it was presented as a cosmic force. Then came the other symbols in the Nazi visual arsenal. The SS adopted the Doppel-Seegrune, two lightning bolt runes representing victory, based on ancient Germanic symbols reinterpreted by occultist Guido von List. The Death's Head units, which would administer concentration camps, used skull insignia to project terror. The red and black color scheme appeared everywhere. Red for revolutionary socialism, black for Teutonic military tradition, white for Aryan racial purity. Goebbels mandated that all propaganda use these colors in specific proportions. Even Nazi architecture followed strict symbolic guidelines. Buildings were designed to appear eternal, massive stone structures suggesting thousand-year permanence. The Reich Chancellery's entrance hall was 146 meters long, deliberately designed to make visitors feel insignificant as they approached Hitler's office. Every visual element served the same purpose: to make Nazi power appear inevitable, ancient, and eternal. To make resistance seem futile, to make submission seem natural. Meanwhile, across Europe, populations under Nazi occupation faced a different symbol: the yellow Star of David, mandatory for Jews over age 10 in all occupied territories. This wasn't just identification, this was symbolic dehumanization. The star marked its wearer as other, excluded from the protection of society, designated for elimination. German propaganda posters depicted the Star of David alongside rats, disease, and corruption. The visual message was unsubtle. These people aren't fully human. These people threaten your health, your wealth, your children. These people must be removed. The star transformed neighbors into enemies, using nothing but a yellow cloth badge. But while Goebbels saturated Germany with Nazi symbols, the Allies were only beginning to understand the psychological battlefield they'd entered. In Britain, the Ministry of Information was established on September 4, 1939, the day after war was declared. Its initial efforts were clumsy. Early British propaganda posters featured wordy slogans and confusing imagery. Your courage, your cheerfulness, your resolution will bring us victory was grammatically awkward and emotionally distant. Freedom is in peril, defend it with all your might was generic and uninspiring. The third poster in this series, Keep Calm and Carry On, was printed but never distributed. Officials feared it would sound condescending. They were right. The poster sat in storage until it was rediscovered in 2000, becoming a pop culture phenomenon precisely because it never actually served its original propaganda purpose. Then came Victor de Lavelaye's broadcast in January 1941. Belgium had fallen to Nazi occupation in May 1940. De Laveleye, a former justice minister and Olympic tennis player, had fled to London. He was given a radio program on Radio Belgique, BBC's service to occupied Western Europe. During an air raid in a London hotel, de Laveleye and his colleagues had been discussing rallying symbols for resistance. They needed something simple, something that could be written quickly before German patrols arrived, something that worked across multiple languages. De Laveleye realized V was perfect. V for victoire in French, V for vrijheid, freedom, in Flemish, V for victory in English. The same letter worked for Dutch, Norwegian, and Czech resistance. On January 14, 1941, de Laveleye made his broadcast. He urged Belgians to mark the letter V everywhere, on walls, on German vehicles, on the backs of Nazi officers. The response was instantaneous. Within days, V's appeared across Belgium. The BBC, recognizing the campaign's potential, expanded it to French broadcasts, then Dutch, then Norwegian, Czech, and Polish. By June 1941, 6 months after de Lavelaye's initial broadcast, the V symbol had become the defining image of European resistance. The BBC amplified the campaign with brilliant psychological touches. BBC broadcasts to Europe began with Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. The opening notes sound like V in Morse code, 3 short notes and 1 long, ... V. The choice was genius. Beethoven was German. His music couldn't be dismissed as foreign propaganda. But the Fifth Symphony's theme is fate knocking at the door, an ominous message for Nazi occupiers. German soldiers across Europe heard those 4 notes and knew that millions of Europeans were marking V's, planning resistance, awaiting liberation. The music became a weapon. Then Winston Churchill personally endorsed the V campaign on July 19, 1941. Churchill had initially been skeptical. Resistance movements made him nervous, as they might provoke brutal Nazi reprisals. But by mid-1941, Britain desperately needed to show its European allies that liberation was coming. Churchill made his radio address at midnight. The V sign is the symbol of the occupied territories and a portent of the fate awaiting the Nazi tyranny, he announced. So long as the peoples of Europe continue to refuse all collaboration with the invader, it is sure that his cause will perish and that Europe will be liberated. From that moment forward, Churchill made the V sign with his fingers at every public appearance. His staff had to explain that holding the hand palm inward, the traditional British gesture, actually meant something obscene to the working class. Churchill adjusted, always showing the V with palm outward. The symbol became inseparable from his public image. Photographs show Churchill making the V sign from train platforms, from reviewing stands, from the back of jeeps touring liberated cities. It appeared on British propaganda posters alongside images of RAF fighters and advancing troops. The message was clear. V meant the Allies were winning. V meant liberation was coming. V meant that every day of Nazi occupation brought the Reich one day closer to destruction. Nazi Germany tried to co-opt the symbol. Goebbels ordered German propaganda to claim the V stood for Victoria, German victory. German artists added laurel leaves beneath the V to distinguish their version. Nazi soldiers painted V's on tanks and vehicles. German propaganda films showed Hitler making V gestures. But the effort failed. The V belonged to the occupied territories. The Allies had won the symbolic war for this letter. No amount of Nazi propaganda could reclaim it. Meanwhile, in the United States, another symbol was being repurposed for war. Uncle Sam, the personification of America, had existed since the War of 1812. But the "I Want You" poster, created by James Montgomery Flagg in 1917, was brought back for World War II recruitment. The original poster was actually adapted from a British design by Alfred Leet showing Lord Kitchener. Flagg had simply put Uncle Sam's face on the body and changed the uniform. The poster was effective in World War I. It was even more effective in World War II. Uncle Sam's stern gaze and pointing finger created direct personal confrontation. The poster didn't ask, it didn't plead. It demanded, it accused. If you weren't serving, you were failing America. But the United States' most powerful propaganda symbol wasn't Uncle Sam. It was Rosie the Riveter. The "We Can Do It" poster, created by J. Howard Miller in 1943, showed a woman in work clothes flexing her biceps. The image was commissioned by Westinghouse Electric to boost worker morale. It was never widely distributed during the war. But the symbol it represented, women's industrial work supporting the war effort, became central to American homefront propaganda. Millions of women went to work in factories producing bombers, tanks, ships, and ammunition. Propaganda posters showed women operating riveting guns, welding steel, and assembling aircraft. The message was clear: everyone contributes, everyone sacrifices, everyone fights, even if they never leave home. American propaganda also specialized in dehumanizing enemy symbols. Japanese and German leaders were depicted as monsters, rats, and demons in countless posters. One poster showed Hitler with the caption, "Stop this monster that stops at nothing." Another depicted a monstrous hand wearing a swastika ring crushing the Constitution and Bill of Rights. The visual vocabulary was less sophisticated than Goebbels' work. But it was effective. Americans bought $185 billion in war bonds, enough to fund almost half the war effort. Production of military equipment reached levels German planners had considered impossible. In 1944 alone, American factories produced 96,000 aircraft, 17,000 tanks, and hundreds of thousands of vehicles. The propaganda posters on factory walls, showing soldiers depending on home-front workers, had worked. In the Soviet Union, propaganda symbols took on their own unique character. The hammer and sickle, representing the unity of industrial workers and peasants, had been adopted in 1922. The symbol appeared on the Soviet flag alongside a red star, representing the Communist Party's goal of world revolution. Soviet propaganda was direct, bold, and uncompromising. Posters featured heroic workers, massive machinery, and enemies depicted as spiders or snakes. The color red dominated Soviet imagery, representing both the revolutionary struggle and the blood of workers fighting oppression. Soviet propaganda emphasized sacrifice and collective duty rather than individual achievement. Posters showed workers alongside soldiers with slogans like "Everything for the front," "Everything for victory." When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Soviet propaganda shifted dramatically. The focus moved from communist ideology to Russian nationalism. Posters invoked historical Russian military heroes like Alexander Nevsky and Dmitry Donskoy. The message was no longer about world revolution. It was about defending the motherland from German barbarism. Soviet propaganda depicted German soldiers as murderers, rapists, and destroyers of Russian culture. One famous poster showed a woman pointing at two German soldiers lurking behind her with the caption, "Did you talk too much?" The poster borrowed directly from American loose-lip sink ships designs. Propaganda had become an international exchange. Each side studied the other's techniques and adapted them. The psychological impact of these symbols was measurable. In occupied France, the BBC's Radio Londres broadcasts, always beginning with the Beethoven Fifth Notes, reached an estimated 30 million listeners by 1944. Resistance groups used BBC broadcasts to coordinate sabotage operations. The famous broadcast of Verlaine's poem Chanson d'automne on June 5, 1944, signalled French resistance to begin railway demolitions hours before the Normandy landings. The poem itself was meaningless, but it had been established as a code. The symbol, the poem, the V, the BBC call sign, triggered thousands of coordinated resistance actions. Symbols had become operational military tools. By 1943, the symbolic war had evolved into a sophisticated psychological operation. The Allies created the Political Warfare Executive to run black propaganda operations. Britain operated powerful radio transmitters that posed as German stations. Soldatensender Calais pretended to be a Wehrmacht insider station broadcasting to German troops. It mixed accurate military information with demoralization propaganda. German soldiers couldn't tell if it was real or fake. That was the point. The station played American swing music, forbidden in Germany, alongside news of German defeats. It spread rumors about Nazi leadership, incompetence, and corruption. It gave instructions for how German soldiers could safely surrender to Allied forces. The Americans developed Operation Cornflakes, fake German mail. U.S. aircraft bombed German mail trains, then dropped 320 replica mail bags filled with forged letters and copies of an anti-Nazi newspaper called Das Neue Deutschland. German postal workers, following regulations, delivered 96,000 pieces of Allied propaganda directly to German homes. The newspaper looked authentic. It used Nazi typographic conventions. It was printed on paper, stolen from German supplies. The only difference was the content: factual reporting about German defeats, stories of Nazi corruption, and arguments for immediate surrender. Thousands of Germans read Allied propaganda, believing it was an underground German resistance newspaper. But the most powerful symbols weren't printed. They were lived. When Allied forces liberated Paris in August 1944, French civilians greeted them with the V sign. Photographs show crowds of thousands, every hand raised in the V gesture. When Soviet forces raised the red banner over the Reichstag on May 1, 1945, they were planting more than a flag. They were declaring symbolic ownership of the Nazi capital. The photograph became the defining image of Soviet victory. When American soldiers found concentration camps and documented the evidence, they weren't just recording history. They were creating symbols that would justify the entire war. The images of Dachau, Buchenwald, and Bergen-Belsen became proof that the fight against Nazi symbolism, the swastika, the SS runes, the Nazi eagle, had been a fight against evil itself. Joseph Goebbels understood what was happening. In his diary entry from February 18, 1945, with Soviet forces 65 kilometers from Berlin, he wrote about the failure of Nazi propaganda. "The enemy has understood how to make effective propaganda out of our mistakes," he admitted. "Our symbols, which once inspired devotion, now inspire only hatred." The swastika, which had represented inevitable victory in 1939, represented guaranteed defeat in 1945. German soldiers removed swastika insignia from uniforms to avoid being targeted. German civilians buried Nazi memorabilia to avoid retribution. The symbol that Goebbels had made inescapable became radioactive. On April 30, 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on his bunker, Adolf Hitler committed suicide. On May 1, 1945, Joseph Goebbels poisoned his 6 children and then had an SS officer shoot him. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. On May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, millions of people across liberated territories made the V sign. Churchill made the V sign from the balcony of the Ministry of Health in London. Eisenhower made the V sign from his jeep in France. Stalin raised a glass in Moscow beneath Soviet banners. The symbolic war was over. The Allies had won. But the symbols themselves would never fully die. After the war, Allied authorities ordered the removal of all Nazi symbols from German public spaces. The swastika was scratched off buildings, monuments, and signs. Wehrmacht eagles were removed from government offices. SS runes were ground off gravestones. The Allied Control Council passed laws banning Nazi symbols and their display. These laws remain in effect today. In Germany, displaying a swastika can result in 3 years in prison. The symbol went from representing a 1,000-year Reich to representing the ultimate cautionary tale about propaganda's power. The Allied symbols had better fates. The V for victory sign persisted. It became the peace sign in the 1960s counterculture movement. It appeared in the 2009 Iranian protests. It appeared in the 2011 Arab Spring. It appears today in every conflict where people resist authority. Churchill's gesture, born from a Belgian tennis player's desperate idea during an air raid, became the universal symbol of defiance and hope. Uncle Sam still appears in US military recruitment materials. Rosie the Riveter became a feminist icon. The hammer and sickle still appears on Chinese, Vietnamese, and Laotian flags. The Soviet Red Star still marks Russian military aircraft. Symbols don't die, they transform. They adapt, they wait. In 1946, the Allied forces conducted extensive interrogations of surviving Nazi officials. One of the questions posed to Albert Speer, Hitler's architect and armaments minister, was about the effectiveness of Nazi propaganda. Speer's answer was revealing. What distinguished the Third Reich from all previous dictatorships was its use of all means of communication to sustain itself and deprive its objects of the power of independent thought, he said. The symbols, the flags, the badges, the uniforms weren't decoration. They were the regime itself. The interrogators asked about Allied propaganda. Speer admitted that by 1944, German intelligence knew the V campaign had made continued occupation impossible. Every wall in every occupied city carried that letter, he said. Our soldiers saw it hundreds of times per day. It was psychological warfare in its purest form. The population was telling us, we are waiting, we are watching, we will remember. But Speer noted something else. The swastika gave us power for 12 years. The V gave you power for 4. But the real victory wasn't symbolic, it was industrial. He was referring to American war production. By 1944, the United States was producing more military equipment than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. The factories that the Rosie the Riveter posters recruited women into had outproduced the entire Axis. The symbols motivated people, but the production won the war. Yet symbols mattered in ways that went beyond motivation. The V campaign cost Nazi Germany real resources. German soldiers spent countless hours painting over or scratching out Vs from walls. Wehrmacht intelligence devoted personnel to tracking resistance symbols and estimating morale in occupied territories. Goebbels' propaganda ministry spent millions of Reichsmarks on counter-propaganda to undermine the V campaign. Every Reichsmark spent on propaganda was a Reichsmark not spent on weapons. Every soldier assigned to remove Vs was a soldier not fighting at the front. Symbolic warfare had tangible military costs. The same was true for the Allies. The Office of War Information employed 30,000 people at its peak. Britain's political warfare executive ran dozens of operations, employing thousands more. The fake German radio stations required massive transmitters. Aspidistra, the transmitter used for Soldatensender Calais, was the most powerful transmitter in the world. Operation Cornflakes required aircraft, pilots, and intelligence personnel. The entire propaganda apparatus cost hundreds of millions of dollars. But intelligence assessments determined that psychological operations shortened the war. German desertion rates spiked after exposure to Allied propaganda. Resistance sabotage, coordinated through BBC radio signals, disrupted German logistics. The Italian surrender in September 1943 was preceded by months of Allied propaganda leaflets and radio broadcasts demoralizing Italian troops. The symbolic war had measurable effects on battlefield outcomes. After D-Day on June 6, 1944, Allied forces advanced faster than expected because French resistance, coordinated through radio laundries, had sabotaged German reinforcement routes. When US forces entered German cities in 1945, they found safe conduct passes, Allied propaganda leaflets promising good treatment to deserters, in the pockets of thousands of surrendering German soldiers. When Soviet forces advanced into Eastern Europe, local populations identified collaborators using underground newspapers, printed on clandestine presses, that had been disseminating anti-Nazi propaganda for years. Symbols created networks. Networks enabled resistance. Resistance created military advantage. By VJ Day on August 15, 1945, when Japan surrendered following atomic bombings, the symbolic war had been fought on 6 continents. An estimated 400 million people across Europe had been exposed to some form of World War II propaganda. Over 100 billion leaflets had been printed and distributed by all sides. Thousands of propaganda posters were created in dozens of languages. Radio broadcasts reached every occupied territory. Films reinforced propaganda themes in every country, and the impact lasted for generations. Post-war American culture was shaped by Uncle Sam and Rosie the Riveter. Post-war European culture was shaped by memories of resistance symbols like the V. Post-war Soviet culture was shaped by hammer and sickle imagery celebrating the Great Patriotic War. Post-war German culture was shaped by the complete absence of Nazi symbols, a void that itself became meaningful. Today, historians recognize that World War II was fought on 2 fronts. The military front, where armies clashed and millions died, and the psychological front, where symbols, slogans, and images competed for control of human belief. The military front was won by the Allies' superior production capacity, strategic leadership, and ultimate atomic monopoly. But the psychological front mattered. It determined whether occupied populations collaborated or resisted. It determined whether soldiers fought to the death or surrendered when defeat was obvious. It determined whether home front populations accepted sacrifice or demanded peace. Goebbels understood this. Churchill understood this. Roosevelt understood this. Stalin understood this. The lesson they all learned was simple but profound. Symbols don't replace bullets, but symbols determine who's willing to fire bullets, and at whom, and for how long. A swastika on a flag could make a teenager volunteer to die on the Eastern Front. A V chalked on a wall could make a factory worker sabotage a railway that would later derail a supply train. An image of Uncle Sam pointing could make a young man enlist who otherwise would have stayed home. A hammer and sickle on a banner could convince a peasant to fight through 3 years of the bloodiest warfare in human history. In the end, the symbols both sides used to control the hearts of Europe did exactly that. They controlled hearts. They didn't determine battlefield outcomes by themselves, but they determined whether populations were willing to endure the sacrifices necessary to achieve those battlefield outcomes. They determined whether nations could sustain total war for 6 years. They determined whether liberation was greeted with joy or with ambiguity. Victor de Laveleye, the Belgian tennis player who proposed the V campaign, survived the war. He returned to Belgium in 1944 and resumed his political career. But he never forgot that night in the London hotel during the air raid, when he proposed a simple letter as a rallying cry. In a 1960 interview, he reflected on the campaign's success. "I thought it would be a small gesture, something to lift spirits during the darkest time. I never imagined that one letter, one symbol, would appear on 1,000,000 walls, inspire 1,000,000 acts of resistance, and become the image that defined European defiance." But that's the power of symbols. They're simple, they're universal, and once they take root in people's hearts, they become impossible to erase. Joseph Goebbels' final diary entry, written hours before his death, contained a bitter acknowledgement. "We created symbols that moved millions. We created pageantry that stunned the world. We created a visual language that made the impossible seem inevitable. But in the end, symbols mean nothing if the cause they represent is rotten. The swastika will be remembered, but it will be remembered as a warning, not an inspiration." He was right. Today, the swastika remains banned in much of Europe. It serves as a universal symbol of evil, the opposite of what Hitler and Goebbels intended. The SS runes, the Nazi eagle, the death's head, all survive only in history books and museums. They're studied as examples of what not to do, not what to emulate. But the V sign lives on. It's flashed by protesters in Hong Kong. It appears in photos from Ukraine, Syria, Iran, and Myanmar. It's made by political candidates declaring victory. It's used by athletes celebrating triumph. Churchill's gesture, born from desperation in 1941, became the universal human gesture for defiance, hope, and eventual success against oppression. The symbols both sides used to control the hearts of Europe revealed a fundamental truth about human psychology. We need symbols. We need visual shorthand for complex ideas. We need ways to signal belonging to our tribe and opposition to the other tribe. We need images that bypass rational thought and speak directly to emotion. Totalitarian regimes exploit this need. Democratic societies try to harness it responsibly. But the need itself never disappears. In 1945, the Allied victory proved that propaganda and symbols, while powerful, couldn't overcome material reality. Germany's propaganda machine was the most sophisticated in history. But Germany's industrial capacity was insufficient to fight the world. The Soviet hammer and sickle mobilized millions. But Soviet victory required 27 million dead and American Lend-Lease equipment. American optimism and Uncle Sam recruited a massive military. But American victory required nuclear weapons and 4 years of industrial mobilization. British resilience and the V campaign kept resistance alive, but British survival required American entry into the war and Soviet sacrifice on the Eastern Front. Symbols mattered, but they weren't enough. Yet the war also proved that symbols were necessary. Without propaganda, without visual rallying points, without shared symbols of resistance and hope, the material advantages might never have been mobilized. American factories needed Rosie the Riveter posters to recruit women workers. British resistance needed the V campaign to maintain morale through the Blitz. Soviet soldiers needed hammer and sickle banners to motivate offensives against overwhelming odds. French resistance needed Radio Londres broadcasts to coordinate sabotage. Symbols were the psychological infrastructure that made physical victory possible. Today, World War II propaganda is studied in military academies, psychology departments, and advertising schools. The techniques developed by Goebbels, the political warfare executive, and the Office of War Information became the foundation of modern strategic communication. Political campaigns use simplified symbols, logos, slogans, colors, derived from WWT's propaganda techniques. Commercial advertising employs psychological principles first weaponized during the war. Modern military psychological operations descend directly from Allied and Axis propaganda departments. The symbols themselves, the swastika, the V, the hammer and sickle, Uncle Sam, remain potent. They still trigger emotional responses decades after the war ended. They still signify tribal belonging. They still represent ideas too complex to state in words, but simple enough to recognize in an instant. The battle for Europe's heart through symbols revealed something troubling about human nature. We are remarkably easy to manipulate through visual imagery. We will sacrifice, fight, and die for symbols we adopt as our own. We will hate, dehumanize, and kill those marked by opposing symbols. Propaganda works not because people are stupid. It works because humans are visual, tribal, pattern-seeking animals whose rational faculties evolved to serve emotional and social goals, not objective truth. But the same truth offers hope. Symbols can motivate resistance as effectively as they motivate oppression. The V campaign proved that simple imagery could unify disparate resistance movements across a dozen countries. Radio broadcasts proved that media could be used to coordinate liberation rather than consolidation of power. The documentation of concentration camps proved that powerful images could shift entire populations toward justice. The symbols both sides used to control the hearts of Europe ultimately controlled something deeper. They controlled the story people told themselves about who they were and what they were fighting for. For Germans indoctrinated by Nazi propaganda, the swastika represented restoring pride after humiliation. For occupied Europeans, the V represented hope that liberation was coming. For Americans, Uncle Sam and Rosie represented duty to defend freedom. For Soviets, the hammer and sickle represented survival against fascist extermination. Each symbol told a story. Each story motivated action. Each action determined the war's outcome. In 1946, as the Nuremberg trials processed Nazi war criminals, the swastika appeared one final time in an official capacity. It was displayed as evidence of Nazi ideology. It was photographed as documentation of crimes against humanity. It was recorded for history as a warning. Then it was banned. The banners that had covered Germany were burned. The eagles that had adorned buildings were removed. The symbols that had controlled millions were consigned to museums and history books. But in those same months, the V for victory became a permanent fixture in Western culture. It appeared in victory parades. It was carved into memorial stones. It was adopted by post-war political movements as a symbol of legitimate triumph over tyranny. Churchill's V sign became his enduring legacy, the image that appears in every photograph, every painting, every memorial depicting Britain's war leader. Victor de Laveleye's 4-minute radio broadcast had created something more durable than the Third Reich's decade of propaganda. He created a symbol that outlived the regime it opposed. He created a gesture that transcended the war that spawned it. He created an image that continues to represent human resistance to oppression 8 decades later. Joseph Goebbels created powerful symbols, but he created them in service of an ideology that couldn't survive contact with reality. The swastika moved millions, but it moved them toward defeat, death, and disgrace. The final lesson of World War II's symbolic warfare isn't about techniques. It's about truth. Propaganda that serves evil can dominate in the short term, but propaganda that serves liberation has the power to outlive its creators, outlast its original purpose, and become a permanent part of human visual language. The V endures. The swastika is forbidden. The symbols both sides used to control the hearts of Europe achieved their purpose. They controlled hearts. But only one side created symbols that people still want to see. Only one side created images that represent hope rather than horror. Only one side won the war. And only one side won the peace that followed, by creating symbols that people across the world still choose to adopt, still use to express their own resistance, still flash when they need to communicate one simple message: we will not submit. We will resist. We will overcome. V for victory. A simple letter, a hand gesture, a symbol that changed the world, 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 changed